In some ways, it seems like only yesterday. In others, it was a lifetime ago. This Saturday marks the 20th anniversary of the September 11th attacks, the deadliest such events in human history. Nearly 3,000 people died, including more than 340 firefighters and 72 law enforcement officers. Some 25,000 people were injured. The next day, September 12th, Chicago Tonight reported on the aftermath here in Chicago. From back in 2001, here is Rich Samuels.
Chicago returned to normal today with notable exceptions. The financial markets remained closed and enhanced security was visible around public buildings. The city today encouraged owners of private high-rises, residential and commercial, to do likewise.
First, they need to be very vigilant, and they need to be proactive, Each one of these buildings have security regulation. They can have a security policy, a security protocol, things that they have to go through. And right now, we're at the height of security, not only in this city, but across the country. And it's time for them to enforce those protocols.
At 12:30 today, the mayor announced that City Hall will become the venue for a blood drive. By 1:30, the line of would-be donors stretched more than half a block.
It was an eerie sight, a sparkling clear day and vast empty runways. Nothing was moving. Planes that carry much of the nation's mail, both UPS and FedEx, sat silently on the ground. Information as to when the airport would reopen changed throughout the day.
To the extent that we are moving or starting operations, that's why I said we're going to allow passengers who were diverted yesterday to be continuing on those flights.
But it was not clear when even those limited flights would be able to take off. Mayor Daley bristled when pressed on when O'Hare would reopen.
You cannot open one airport in this country and fly nowhere. It's impossible. And so that's why this has to be done in full cooperation with the airlines and FAA. Even though you open an airport, you have no place to go.
When passengers are allowed back here, it will be under very different rules, says the FAA. No curbside check-in, no off-airport check-in, no e-tickets. Only ticketed passengers allowed beyond security checks.
That was Rich Samuels and Elizabeth Brackett reporting for Chicago Tonight back on September 12th, 2001. Now, 20 years later, we assess what we've learned about terrorist threats and how safe the country is today. Joining us for that discussion are Thomas Makaitis, a DePaul University history professor with a focus on terrorism and international security. Hatem Abudaya, Executive Director of the Arab American Action Network, a local nonprofit organized for the Arab community in Chicago. And Robert Pape, a University of Chicago political science professor specializing in international security affairs. We welcome all of you here back to Chicago Tonight. And Professor Pape, I want to start with you because you were on this program right after 9/11, giving your thoughts on what had transpired. Let's take a look at that.
States and societies that have faced this level of air attack routinely go through emotional periods of tremendous anger, tremendous grief, and tremendous fear, which breeds deep desire for retribution and heavy retribution. The dilemma that we face in this case is that moving too quickly and too hastily for bowing to that emotion, I feel it myself, bowing to that emotion too hastily could well make matters worse.
As we know, in very short order, the United States engaged in wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. So, Robert Pape, knowing what you said there, did the U.S. Act too hastily after 9/11?
Yes, unfortunately, that clip really captures the heart of the reason for the problems that we've experienced in the war on terror. So although many of us hoped that the fear and anger that we felt on that day would not end up leading to overreaction, which would only make problems worse, both for innocents here in our own country, innocents overseas, and actually produce more terrorists than we killed, which was the actual result in Iraq and Afghanistan. The fundamental fact of the matter is that emotional wound of 9/11 caused a tremendous amount of desire for retribution and payback. And that overwhelmed good strategic sense, which then is the core reason underneath why we hassled and abused thousands and thousands of Americans in the United States who were not terrorists.
Right, there's that.
Why we invaded Iraq, which had not been attacking us and didn't have weapons of mass destruction. Underneath it all was unfortunately that emotion that was caused by 9/11.
We know how those two.
That's what the terrorists wanted.
We know how those two conflicts have resulted. Thomas Makaitis, 20 years later, how is life in America still impacted by what happened that day and the subsequent fallout?
Well, the bitter irony is that the anniversary comes immediately after the withdrawal from Iraq. And as Bob said, one of the most unfortunate things was the global war on terrorism, because those of us who studied this were very leery of that from the beginning, because you don't make war on an ism, and it virtually guaranteed perpetual conflict. And we have wasted about $4 trillion on Iraq and Afghanistan. And GWAT became a pretext for invading Afghanistan. And on top of that, the Islamophobia, the anti-immigrant sentiment fueled into what we didn't yet realize at the time was a growing wave of white supremacy, which would peak in 2016 with the election of Donald Trump, and sadly is still very much with us.
Certainly a trend of nativism among some pockets of this country. Hatem Abadia, to that point, how has life changed in the last 20 years for Arab Americans, Muslim Americans, both immediately after 9/11 and still today in 2021?
Yeah, I think it's important to understand that, you know, the United States went into Afghanistan in that war really for its resources, and did the same in Iraq 2 years later. You know, there was the pretext for war, but essentially there were billions and billions of dollars that were made by defense contractors, other multinational corporations, including the Dick Cheney's previous company, Halliburton, of which he was the CEO, and he was as the vice president at that time. So it was a war for empire, and there were rich resources in Afghanistan and Iraq that the U.S. wanted to get a piece of and didn't want China, Russia, and other, some Western European countries to get those. So I believe it's important to talk about the context of the wars as well, and then how they affected our community. Almost immediately, 1,000 Arabs and Muslims were detained. The Patriot Act was passed, massive surveillance of our community across the country. And then special registration of 2002, in which 83,000 men from 24 Arab or Muslim majority countries were forced to get fingerprinted, photographed, interviewed by the INS at the time, Immigration Naturalization Service.
No doubt.
13,000 ended up immediately in deportation proceedings, and not one was convicted of a crime related to terrorism.
Huge
so it was
impact
a broad net that was dropped on the community, and it criminalized and othered us.
Huge impact on the Muslim community. Robert Pape, the justification 20 years ago for these wars was the terror threat that the U.S. faced, as evidenced by 9/11. 20 years later, what is that threat? Is it a higher threat level? Is it a lower threat level?
That's right. But just to be clear, there was a terrorist threat on 9/11. The problem wasn't that we shouldn't have reacted at all. The problem is we shouldn't have overreacted so massively that we would actually create more terrorists than we were killing in the effort to make ourselves safer. Now, today, we are still under its Al-Qaeda. We have taken its bases out of Afghanistan. We've killed bin Laden. Took us 10 years, but yes, we did kill bin Laden. And so in the sense of Al-Qaeda, Al-Qaeda is a shell of its former self. But the war on terror, invading those two countries, harming so many people, that has stirred up a hornet's nest of terrorists. And so we have to be aware that going forward, terrorism remains a clear and present danger. Our challenge is not to overreact again. We should have followed policies that are now called over the horizon, that is, relied on selective use of air power, our intelligence, occasional use of special forces. That's what got bin Laden. That's the kind of policy that defeated ISIS.
And this is what
we should have been doing that from the
President,
beginning, and we need to do that
President
going
Biden
forward.
has been talking about employing these kinds of policies. Thomas Mockaitis, in your view, how has the terror threat to the United States changed, both externally and now internally, given January 6th?
Yeah, well, the first thing is we have made the likelihood of a catastrophic 9/11 style attack much harder to pull off. I'm not worried about Afghanistan being a base for terrorism because the day of the big terrorist training camp is over. They're going to hit us the way they did in Paris, the way they did at the Pulse nightclub, the way they did on January 6th to recognize the domestic threat. Small-scale attacks, cells, lone wolves. Right now, I continue to be far more concerned about far-right white supremacist groups operating inside the United States with a anti-government militia, sovereign citizen kind of mentality. I think the major ISIS splinter, IS Khorasan, is going to be so busy battling the Taliban for the foreseeable future that I don't think it poses a serious threat. Terrorism is a persistent problem, not an existential threat. And Bob's absolutely right. We don't want to become an enemy to ourselves and our neighbors by making it the focus of our attention the way we have.
And Hatem Abudaya, has Islamophobia curbed in the last 20 years? You mentioned what happened after 9/11. Is it better now than it was then?
Yeah, I think it's been very consistent. And remember, the Islamophobia and the anti-Arab, and really anti-immigrant, anti-black, anti-people of color sentiment is not just an interpersonal attack. It's not just an issue of hate crimes, which we did see and we still see to this day. It's really an issue of the policy and the legislation that was passed after September 11th to really broadly criminalize and scapegoat the Arab community. The thing that I'm most concerned about, in all honesty, is that, it is the United States. We have to say and we have to recognize and admit after all these years that, has on some level supported these organizations that we're talking about. The U.S. supported Osama bin Laden's forces, which eventually became Al-Qaeda. They supported the Taliban for years and years, especially because the Taliban and bin Laden were fighting the Soviet Union back in the day. And even to this day, we've gotten a quote from President Biden. Our biggest problem was our allies. He told students at the Harvard Kennedy School. The Turks, the Saudis, the Emiratis, what were they doing? They were so determined to take down Syrian President Bashar al-Assad and essentially have a proxy Sunni Shia war. What did they do? They poured hundreds of millions of dollars.
There's certainly a lot.
Thousands of tons of weapons.
We're out of time.
Anyone that would fund Assad, that came from the United States. That's what's important to understand.
Certainly tangled alliances and a lot to sort of look back on and analyze over the last 20 years. And our thanks to Thomas Mockaitis, Hatem Abudaya, and Robert Pape. Thank you all so much.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.